We have a major problem with Islamist gangs in our prisons. Through appeasement and weak leadership, they've been able to take control of prison wings. There are reports of Sharia courts enforced by floggings and beatings. The Times reports that separation centres designed to contain the people capable of radicalisation are now being used as shelters from the people that they're targeting. Paedophiles and serial killers like Levi Belfield are converting to Islam for protection. Prison officers even say that sniffer dogs in the unit that contained the Manchester Arena plotter, Hashim Abedi, were called off for fear of offending Muslim terrorists. The public expect the government to act. It's time that they reclaimed control of our prisons. That's why I went to see Ian Acheson, a former prison governor, an expert on extremism in our jails.
We've got about 230 terrorist offenders. We've got a larger subset of prisoners who are deemed to be at risk of being radicalised. And we've also got them in very close proximity to more traditional, if you like, organised crime gangs that are controlling the drugs trade in prisons. And where those two groups are together, it's absolutely rational to think that they will cooperate in some way. And then you've got a very serious problem. And I don't think there are sufficient protections in place to prevent that from happening.
And just the other day, we heard Axel Rudakabana, the Southport killer, who's here at Belmarsh, allegedly attack prison officer with boiling water in a kettle. How is that even possible?
This is a wretched young man who has committed acts of extreme violence in a pre-planned way. And who, as far as we know, because obviously it's still going through court, ambushed a prison officer and seriously injured them. So why he was in a position where apparently no account was taken of the extreme and obvious risk he poses is a question that the Ministry of Justice should be answering.
And is this that prison governors are incompetent, or is it that they are appeasing Muslim gangs and terrorists in our prisons? Because it doesn't feel as if they're putting the safety of prison officers first. And to me, prison officers' safety should be put first every single day.
Well, I agree. We want prison staff to be present in our jails, to be able to make sure they're run safely, and to also allow rehabilitation to take place. Now, you asked me about prison governors. I think prison governors are being asked to do an impossible job at the minute. The moral injury of doing far too much for far too long with far too little has actually, pushed some of them over the edge, and not surprisingly so. But I do think it is certainly worth exploring this culture of appeasement that frontline prison staff are telling me about, where senior managers within different prisons are actually placing the rights of prisoners above the rights of prison staff to go to work in the morning and come home of a shift still whole, and not via A&E, for example. And we've seen some really horrible examples recently of exactly that happening.
Yeah, we've seen these examples like when boiling oil was thrown at an officer, where someone was able, Hashim Abedi, the Manchester Arena plotter, was able to get hold of a makeshift weapon and stab an officer. This is just completely unacceptable. And some of these things are happening in so-called separation centres, which are supposed to be places where the most dangerous individuals, those most likely to radicalise other prisoners, are kept in a condition where they can't cause trouble. And yet, it doesn't seem to be working, does it?
Well, I conceived of the idea of separation centres back in 2016, and I offered the government this as a solution. And I think there's more distance to travel on this, particularly when you get a very small number of people who are ideologically motivated, like Abedi, who want to kill for ideas, who I believe are still intent on killing for ideas, and have that capacity for high levels of violence, as well as the psychological mindset to try to subvert, undermine and radicalise others. I think there needs to be a different solution for them. And I think if we don't have that solution, I'm really sorry to say this because it's chilling, I think the prospect of a prison officer being murdered on duty is closer than it's ever been. So that's why when I talk to people generally, I talk to the media about prison officer safety, I say at the moment the threat is intolerable.
Yes. And Charlie Taylor, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, he wrote a report not so long ago where he could foresee something like a drone bringing in a gun maybe even bringing people in and out of prisons. But he could foresee a very, very serious incident happening in one of our top security prisons, like a murder of a prison officer, a hostage situation, something that is just intolerable. And we've got to act, haven't we? Because none of us want to see that in a prison. None of us want to be putting prison officers in that kind of real danger that they are right now.
No, you're absolutely right. Charlie Taylor inspected quite recently 2 high security prisons, and he found that the drone defences that they had were either completely missing or broken in terms of netting, in terms of CCTV. And in other prisons, he's basically said these places are a bit like airports, I think. And this is really extreme, coming from the Chief Inspector of Prison. But you've also got the prospect that something like that payload could easily bring in more Semtex than was smuggled in by a person to Whitemoor Prison or high security prison back in the 90s. Weapons, pistols, ammunition. And if I'm thinking about that and worrying about it and considering it, you can be absolutely sure terrorists inside prison are as well.
It feels to me as if it might only be a matter of time before a prison officer gets killed if the government doesn't step up, get a grip and take action.
We have avoided the murder of a prison officer on duty, not by skill, in the last 3 or 4 years. Sometimes we've come within millimetres and seconds of that happening. There are people that have demonstrated the intent not simply to injure prison staff, but to murder them. Now, ideologically motivated prisoners, be they Islamist or potentially from the extreme right, although there's no evidence that that threat is anything like as large as from Islamist prisoners, they will know what the impact of murdering a prison officer on duty will be. It'll be straight from the IRA's playbook in Northern Ireland in the 80s and 90s, that the best way to destabilise the rule of law inside prisons is to take out a prison officer. Because, look at us. Imagine us going into a place, God forbid, tomorrow morning to work for the state and do an incredibly difficult job if a colleague had been murdered the day before. From a terrorist point of view, it is a perfectly rational act to take.
There seems to be a very high proportion of prisoners in some of our jails who are Muslim today, and many of them have converted whilst they're in prison. What's going on? Are people being forcibly converted?
Well, I'm sure that is happening, but you've got to understand the reasons behind conversions at the moment, and to do that you've got to understand the environment that people are going into. So if you're a young man who's been sentenced to a very long period in custody for say for example a crime of violence, and maybe it's your first time in custody and you're coming in and you're terrified, you're searching for meaning, for belonging, you're actually absolutely ripe for these factions to pick you up unopposed, basically, for your own security. So I think quite a lot of that is happening, and it's changing the dynamics that we are used to in prison. What do I mean when I say that? Well, for example, we're now seeing evidence that convicted sex offenders who in the traditional prison hierarchy were at the bottom of the pile and had to be segregated from the rest of the population for fear that they would be killed by them, we're now seeing them walking openly in normal location because they've come under the protection of Muslim gangs in particular.
This is HMP ISIS, where 45% of prisoners are Muslim. That's the highest of any prison, but it's not that unusual. Such is the level of control that radical preachers or emirs are exerting on prisoners. Very large numbers are converting to Islam. Imams operating across the prison estate are still using the Tabia program to teach inmates about Islam. In 2016, it was criticised for including a section on jihad, in which it said that taking up arms against evil is one of the noblest acts. Look, there's huge problems facing our prisons, with escalating violence against officers, overcrowding, drugs, organised crime gangs. But on top of all of that, you've got Islamist gangs exerting control, taking over prison wings. And at the very sharp end, you've got Islamist terrorists threatening the lives of officers. The government, frankly, don't even recognise the scale and the urgency of this challenge. It's time that the government stepped up and took back control of our prisons before a prison officer's life is endangered.